Hello and welcome to one of my pre-PTR heroic Icecrown Citadel boss guides, where I've gone through and looked over old YouTube VODs, online forums, and Wowhead pages to try and produce a modern, up-to-date boss guide with as much relevant information as possible. I'll try to present each encounter in the most straightforward way that is applicable to everyone, then leave the discussion of boss mechanics, assignments, and logic for later in the video. Now before we get started, if you'd like to see more WoW content or want to help my channel grow, consider dropping a like, subscribing, and sharing this video with a friend. It really helps me out, and I appreciate the support. Otherwise, thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Festergut is a single phase encounter with a 5-minute enrage timer. You will need 2 tanks, 4 to 5 healers, and the rest DPS. This fight is a single target DPS race. Damage dealers need to slam down the boss before the 5-minute enrage timer. Healers need to contend with significant raid and tank damage, and tanks will need to utilize defensives appropriately to avoid flopping. Let's first discuss the boss's mechanics, and then dive into positioning and strategy later on. Shortly after engaging Festergut, the boss will use Gaseous Blight. This ability spawns a raid-wide gas cloud that ticks for about 4,500 shadow damage every 2 seconds. Every 30 seconds, Festergut will use Inhale Blight, and suck up some of the gas in the room. This will reduce the damage dealt by Gaseous Blight, but will increase Festergut's damage dealt and attack speed by 30%. For each cast of Inhale Blight, the raid will take progressively less damage, and the tank progressively more damage until Festergut has used this ability 3 times. At this point, the raid will no longer be taking damage from Gaseous Blight, but the active tank will be taking 260% increased damage. 30 seconds after Festergut's 3rd cast of Inhale Blight, the boss will then cast Pungent Blight. This ability deals up to 75,000 shadow damage to everyone in the raid. To survive this mechanic, raiders must soak gas spores. Similar to Inhale Blight, Festergut will use gas spore 3 times before casting Pungent Blight. When used, this ability will target 3 players, leaving a dot that can be identified by the large spore over the player's head. After 12 seconds, the spore will explode, which deals 2,000 damage to all nearby targets and leaves a stacking debuff, granting 25% resistance to shadow damage. It's imperative the entire raid stacks on these spore targets to gain stacks of this debuff. At 3 stacks of Inoculated, Pungent Blight will no longer one-shot raiders. Note that it's impossible to gain more than 1 stack of Inoculation at the same time, meaning standing within 5 yards of more than 1 spore results in higher damage taken, but not extra Inoculation stacks. Additionally, certain classes can negate the Pungent Blight mechanic through immunities and defensives. Abilities like Divine Shield, Ice Block, Dispersion, and Vanish can enable select classes to ignore soaking spores in favor of doing more damage or healing. If a player without a powerful defensive or an immunity misses a spore soak, try to hit them with an external during Pungent Blight to prevent them from dying. Festergut will also use Gastric Bloat on the main tank roughly every 12 seconds. This ability deals 10,000 nature damage and increases the damage they deal by 10% per stack. Upon reaching 10 stacks, the tank will suffer from a Gastric Explosion. This ability immediately kills the tank, and deals 30,000 shadow damage to all players within 10 yards. This will likely wipe your raid if it goes off. To avoid this, have an off-tank taunt off the main tank at 9 stacks of Gastric Bloat. This debuff lasts 100 seconds, so aside from the first taunt swap, tanks must not taunt before 9 stacks are reached. Finally, Festergut will use a Vile Gas on a random ranged player, affecting them and anyone within 7 yards of them. This ability is a conflagration type effect that disorients the target and deals 4,000 damage every 2 seconds. Much like General Vezax's Shadow Crash, this ability will not target players in melee as long as there are at least 8 ranged players in 25-man or 3 in 10-man. This mechanic largely dictates our positioning for this fight. Have ranged players spread in a semicircle around the boss, roughly 8 to 10 yards apart from each other. Since Vile Gas requires ranged players to spread, but Gas Spore requires players to stack, players outside of melee range will need to move a lot and will have significantly worse uptime. As such, it's a good idea to assign the fewest number of players to sit in ranged, such that melee aren't being targeted by Vile Gas. This may mean assigning certain range DPS and healers to stand with the melee, but exactly which players are assigned to melee will depend on preference and raid comp. On the other hand, the melee group will just blast the boss the entire fight. In the normal version of this encounter, the only movement required of players in melee will be during Gas Spore. The entire raid, including tanks, need to get the 25% reduced shadow damage debuff, so melee players positioned behind the boss will need to move to the tank to ensure they get this debuff. Gaseous Spores will spawn on 3 random players. Because most of the raid will be in melee range, it's likely at least one player in melee will be targeted by a spore, in which case said player, and everyone else in melee, needs to stack on the tanks by the time the spore expires. If 2 spawn in melee, the same thing applies. However, if 3 spawn in melee, one of the spore targets will need to move out and stand with ranged so they have a place to stack. For ranged players, there are a few different methods of handling the spore mechanic. The first and most simple strategy is to have targeted players stand still, and let other ranged players come to them. The upside to this strategy is that ranged players can immediately identify where they need to move to. The downside is that if the spore target is far from other ranged players, they will lose uptime during this movement. An alternative strategy, we'll call it the stack strategy, is to assign a central position, normally one of your ranged players, as a spore location, such that when a spore spawns on a ranged player, they will always move to this spot. This strategy is particularly effective if you have the fewest number of players assigned to sitting in ranged. This way, no ranged player finds themselves being excessively far away, and you can assign positions to classes based on how mobile they are. So classes without mobility need to move less, and classes with mobility move more. If 2 ranged players are targeted by a spore with this strat, have one player move to the designated spore location, and the other can remain planted. If it's unclear which player needs to move, having both spore targets move to the stack point is also viable. The AoE damage spores deal upon expiring is rather insignificant, so taking damage from multiple spores is fine. However, if 3 ranged players are targeted, 1 ranged player will need to run to the melee and stack on the tank. Finally, the heroic mechanic for Festergut can make the melee-heavy stack slightly awkward. We'll discuss this mechanic in more detail later, but if your raid chooses not to heavily stack in melee, assign 2 distinct locations as stack points for spores. Then spore targets will move to the closest location. If 2 or more players in the melee stack are targeted, 1 or more of them will need to run out to one of these locations. We'll call this the spread strategy. These are just a few examples of positioning strategies, and others are viable. Ultimately, which one is used will boil down to personal preference. Moving on, tanks will need to use their defensives appropriately to avoid dying after Festergut has used Inhale Blight multiple times. After the 3rd Inhale Blight cast, Festergut will have 90% increased attack speed and deal 90% increased damage, resulting in 260% increased damage taken. It's a good idea to plan defensive cooldowns ahead of time. Much like Algalon, utilizing add-ons like Method Raid tools to coordinate defensive cooldown usage can help with tank survivability. Tanks also need to be mindful during the taunt swap. The first taunt swap will need to occur right around when Festergut is about to cast Inhale Blight for the 3rd time, and the 2nd time after the 5th Inhale. Switching during an Inhale cast is a good idea, because while inhaling, Festergut stops DPS for a short moment. It's not possible to taunt earlier, because the debuff lasts 100 seconds. The exception to which being if you have a Paladin tank that can use Divine Shield. After the taunt swap, the prior tank will deal 90% increased damage for 100 seconds. More damage equals more threat, so the previous tank must be careful not to immediately pull threat. It's a good idea to use Blessing of Salvation on the previous tank to mitigate their threat generation. Additionally, the previous tank can temporarily disable any additional threat generating buffs. For example, Paladins can disable Righteous Fury, Druids can swap to Cat Form, and DKs can swap to Blood Presence. Just be sure to swap any threat generating abilities back on when you next need to tank again. Finally, on heroic difficulty, Professor Putricide will periodically fling malleable goo from his balcony as he watches the fight. All players may be targeted by this ability. If players are in the blast radius, they suffer from a 12-second, 250% increased attack and casting speed debuff. If DPS are debuffed, you will have difficulty beating the enrage timer. If healers are debuffed, the tank will likely die. Utilize the south side of the room so you have more time to react to malleable goo. The target of this ability is indicated by a small green puddle on the floor. Simply move out of it to avoid taking this damage. Note that the blast radius is larger than the puddle makes it out to be. Malleable goo can occur during times the raid is stacked up for gaseous spore. Therefore, all players must know how to position themselves while not being blasted by the goo. With the introduction of this heroic mechanic, utilizing the stack strategy means players in melee range will frequently be targeted by this ability. This is where spread strategy's viability is realized. By placing all ranged outside of the melee stack, malleable goo becomes easier to identify and avoid. Regardless of strategy, once players learn to dodge the goo while fulfilling their roles, the heroic version of this encounter becomes much less intimidating. Otherwise, that concludes the fight. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more ICC guides coming soon. See ya.